Welcome everyone to this seminar. We've called it the IDRIS HAMID Seminar. The Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid would sign his name Idris Hamid, and he would encourage people to call him Idris, or even children like me to call him Uncle Idris. And we think about him, his remarkable breadth and depth of contributions, and the relevance, significance, and meaning of those contributions for our church, our society, our nation, and our world today. We have several very exciting speakers who can relate their own experiences, share their memories, and their insights about his thinking and teaching, about his life and ministry, his person and work. As we begin, I invite the moderator of the Synod of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago, the Right Reverend Daniel Chance, to open in prayer.
Can we all stand, please? Let us pray. Gracious, holy, and loving Father, as we assemble this morning to remember and acknowledge the work and witness of your servant, Idris Hamid, Lord God, we pray your blessing upon his life and all those who shared life with him. Throughout his ministry, O God, he embodied and transmitted traits which are evident in the life of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Reverend Hamid's will, his spirit of determination to identify, to sit, to listen to the masses, to identify with their specific need, and to implement measures with the view to help, speaks of his ministry of identification and empowerment. God, as we meet, give us all the will, give us the spirit of determination to continue to build on what you inspired your servant to establish. God, as we deliberate, help us all to care for all your people. Bless us, for we pray in your wonderful and precious name. Amen. Please be seated.
Our first presenter will be the Canon Reverend Dr. Nolly Clark, and he will be contacted at this time. He will be presenting over the Zoom platform, and those of you who are watching online should be able to see it seamlessly through the marvels of modern technology. Unknown in Reverend Hamid's time, but so vital and so much part of our lives today. We are grateful that the Reverend Dr. Nolly Clark is able to participate today because he recently suffered a little mishap, so he's at home and recovering from a fall. But at this time, he will present to us his memories, his thoughts about the Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid, and he had reflected deeply on Reverend Hamid's life and work in his own writings as he spoke about what he learned about the liturgy of churches in Trinidad from Reverend Hamid. And he reflected on the fact that very often churches that were formed and targeted towards the oppressed sometimes became so enmeshed in upper middle class perspectives and values and identity that they lost their connection to the poor and disenfranchised. And now we welcome the Reverend Dr. Nolly Clark.
All right. I guess you could start talking now.
Good day. Are you hearing anything?
Hello, morning. No problem. All right, keep going. They're hearing you.
Good day, brothers and sisters. I am very pleased to join you at this time as we celebrate the life and witness and the way that the Reverend Dr. HAMID, IDRIS HAMID, led the theological education programs in the Caribbean. And I say the Caribbean because Idris not only dealt with Trinidad and Tobago, but both of us, I learned from him and tried to embrace persons beyond our shores and also to embrace and involve people, participate in this theological enterprise. Idris HAMID, a friend and colleague, someone I learned so much from, enabled me to participate in the richness of the theological enterprise and partnership in the Caribbean. As you know, we engaged under the principles and ideals of the Caribbean Conference of Churches. And our enterprise was under the ARC, Agency for Renewal of Christian Peoples, and peoples as a whole. The person who led that thing, ARC, was Cardinal Felix. He was the ARC thing, and he highlighted our work. The other person was Robert Cuthbert, who also did tremendous work with our work at St. Andrew's Theological College. St. Andrew's Theological College was a school beyond the Presbyterian church or any church at all. It embraced so many people and so many partners. And today I am very pleased to introduce another person who worked with us. And that person was Gerard Granado. It so happened that I taught him at St. Andrew's at the seminary, and at that seminary, Jerry Granado was able to go undertake an important program, a program for young people, program for Sunday school and Christian education program. And there was another fascinating person who also joined him, Dr. Bailey. And they both brought out the first educational program, Christian educational program, or for young people. And so I am very pleased to be here because that Jerry and myself, I was a teacher at the Roman Catholic Seminary, and Jerry was one of my brightest students. And he was one of the first persons who began the enterprise. But Idris Hamid was the greatest visionary we ever had in the Caribbean. And I am not saying this in any way to laud him unnecessarily. He was. He had a vision for the theological work in the Caribbean, and he did it very well. His work embraced all sorts and conditions. We had a principle that it is the whole people of God, not just the clerics, but the whole people of God should be doing theology. And that is what the Caribbean Conference of Churches held on to. And Idris was I would think, the forerunner in that principle of the enterprise, the whole people of God. So we had teachers, we had persons who were also in the charges and the parishes who took part in our enterprise at St. Andrew's Theological College, or the ecumenical program. In fact, that's what it was called, Christian Education Program, CEP. And the approach was to have many seminars and workshops which would fulfill the programs that we think that was necessary for our work in the Caribbean. And not only did we do it, it wasn't only Caribbean theologians, but we linked with theologians in many places. For example, we linked with the European centers of mission. We work with persons like in North America, persons like Walter Rodney, persons like people who were in a number of things. Mr. Dukaran, Dr. Dukaran, as we know him, he was one of our lecturers. And so the list goes on. So the St. Andrew's Theological College had become a center of things. We also had young people, and that was done by a work, we call it, Lincoln Myers had a number of young people training them. Lincoln was a sociologist, and Lincoln trained those young people to do work in their communities. theology for us was not something in the sanctuary. It's not something in the churches. Theology had to be incarnated in the communities, to drive the communities, give the communities the ethical and moral and spiritual principles that were needed in the Caribbean. And so I would now let you get other persons to share in the enterprise that Idris engaged in, and I had the privilege of working as his partner in many places. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much indeed to Canon the Reverend Dr. Nolly Clark, and our prayers are with him for recovery. And following from his introduction, we have the very person he mentioned, Mr. Gerard Granado. And he will bring to us his memories, thoughts, and insights at this time. Mr. Granado.
So good morning, dear friends and colleagues, those of you present here and those joining us by video link. Good morning to you all. A very special and warm good morning to Idris's two daughters who are with us this morning, Sondralyn and Joanna, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. We are sure that Andrew and Sarah may be with us in spirit. Maybe they got the live stream and maybe they're with us, so welcome to them too. And thank you to your good selves and to Reverend Sunarine and the other organizers for so kindly inviting me to share in this, what I call celebration of remembrance, this moment of blessing this morning. So before going any further, please allow me to convey the warmest greetings of the three presidents of the Caribbean Conference of Churches, the CCC. And those are Reverend Dr. Leslie Anderson, Methodist, and chair of the CCC's three-person presidium. Dr. Oluwakemi Linda Banks, Anglican, laywoman, clinical psychologist, and Archbishop Donald Rees, Archbishop Emeritus, Roman Catholic Archbishop Emeritus of Kingston, Jamaica. Reverend Dr. Anderson remembers Idris with particular gratitude. He told me that when he was here in Trinidad as a young minister, I think on his first mission, he's Panamanian himself, Idris was very, very supportive to him, of him and his work, and guided him in a number of areas. So greetings to them. They asked me especially, knowing that I was going to be here to do that. Friends, I do not think that it is any coincidence that after so many years of Idris's passing, that this seminar is being held this year. The very year of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Caribbean Conference of Churches. It was in November of 1973 that the first General Assembly of the Caribbean Conference of Churches was held in Kingston, Jamaica. After all, the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago was a founding member church of the CCC. In fact, the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago gave to the CCC its first General Secretary in the person of Reverend Dr. Roy Nihal, and its first Lady President in the person of Mrs. Dorinda Sampat, both now of blessed memory. It is said, that coincidence is a situation in which God chooses to remain anonymous. So maybe this convergence of events has something in itself to say to us. So although he was not part of the formal leadership structure of the CCC, Idris was unquestionably a founding father of the Caribbean Conference of Churches. There's no question about that. His celebrated, immortalized monograph, In Search of New Perspectives, was one of the outstanding papers that set the tone and resulted in the birthing of the Caribbean Conference of Churches, the CCC. So, in a real sense, if we could use another metaphor, we could say that Idris was also a midwife at the birth of the CCC. Idris preferred to work on the ground rather than in the formal leadership structures, which he might have considered very bureaucratic. He worked as the head, the director, as you heard from Nolly, of what was, in my opinion, perhaps the most important program of the CCC, the Caribbean Ecumenical Program, or the CEP, as it was called. It was the theological basis of the CCC's work, right here located. Idris negotiated with the then leadership of the CCC to have the Caribbean Ecumenical Program based right here at St. Andrews. Why? Because he saw the immense potential for the synergy between that program and St. Andrew's Theological College, of which he was the principal at the time. So you heard Nolly Clark describe St. Andrew's of the time as its intake being much bigger than any one church and being very ecumenical. Of course, that's a tradition, in a sense, even before Idris, as I have followed the history of the college, that was there. But that was the main reason that he negotiated this location, because of that potential for the synergy between the life of the college and the CCC's theological work, which stemmed far and wide, as Nolly indicated. Maybe that is something that can be properly explored again. It was in the Caribbean Ecumenical Program, the CEP, that I first as a participant and later as a staff member, as again you heard Nolly, that I got to know Idris. As a participant, and I didn't know what Nolly was going to say, and he didn't know what I was going to say, so you're going to get some repetition, sorry. So, as a participant, I was a seminarian at the time at the Roman Catholic Seminary of St. John Vianney and the Uganda Martyrs, located on Mount St. Benedict. It's not the same institution as Mount St. Benedict. People make that mistake all the time. The monks are in their monastery, and the seminary is a seminary. But it so happens that it's a stone's throw away, and I think the diocese got the land from the monks. So there I was, and Reverend Dr. Nolly Clark, who was Idris's partner in the Caribbean Ecumenical Program, was also teaching at the seminary at that time. He told us about the Caribbean Ecumenical Program and all the exciting things that were happening in this program in San Fernando. This was the early 70s, 1970s, in the throes of the socio-cultural ferment of that era, when many of us were exploring the theological significance and implications of all that was happening in Trinidad and Tobago and in the wider Caribbean. So, of course, this piqued our interest when Nolly shared. And a few of us seminarians started to take advantage of what was on offer, so to speak, here through the Caribbean Ecumenical Program and engage with fresh thinking on certain matters. And I can tell you, the thinking was not just fresh, it was refreshing. I want to give you an example of one of the programs that was held here. And there's a serious side to it and there's a funny side to it. As Nolly hinted, we were doing all kinds of things on the CP. I was on board by the time this program was on. It was a program called Ideology and Christianity. And we had very serious, prominent people, international persons coming to be both facilitators and lecturers on these courses. At that time, we invited Father Leslie Lett, Dr. Leslie Lett, a brilliant intellectual, and also Dr. Walter Rodney from Guyana, who was, as the world knows, brutally assassinated some years after. So this was a discussion, a Marxist Christian dialogue. That was the name of the seminar. What's his name? What's the name I just called again? Rodney, yeah. Dr. Rodney was coming in, and in those days the immigration was very, very strict in Trinidad. And we used to forewarn people, especially clergy, when you are coming in, do not say that you're coming to give a lecture, or because they would ask you, where's your work permit? Because it was a religious issue. Anyway, everybody was gathered and waiting for the start of this thing, and we're not seeing Walter Rodney appearing at all as scheduled. His wife came in a taxi, and then we asked her, well, where is Walter? She said, well, immigration officers have detained him. So what's happening? They're questioning him. They allowed me to go ahead, and they're questioning him, because he was a known Marxist in the region. So the communist boogie is operating. Some hours later, we see Walter arriving on his own. And so everybody now is concerned and is eager to find out what happened and what transpired and what questions did they ask you and so on. So we all gathered around him just by dinner time. And so Idris is asking, so what did they ask you? What did you tell them? He said, I told them I was coming to a Christian seminar. So what? Then they asked me if I was a Christian, because of course he's well known in the region as a Marxist. And so we said, and what did you tell them? And in his normal, very calm, subdued tone of voice, Walter said, I told them that that would be decided at the seminar. A Christian Marxist dialogue. So that's why I say it's a serious side, but also a humorous side to it, because it gives you an example of the gravity of the kind of seminar that was held, and also the humorous side. So friends, as we gather today to remember Idris, to remember his life and his work, I think it is important to bear something in mind, and it is this. Memory can serve either to anchor us in a nostalgic but paralyzing past, or it can serve as a life-giving force for renewal, for inspiration and revitalization. Memory lane can become a dead-end alley, depending on how we approach it. And I don't think that's our intention here this morning. So in whatever I share, and I'm not going to be too long again, whether as a personal or an institutional memory, I will try to use it as a lens through which to look for deeper learnings that we can apply as we seek to break new ground. That's the important thing, to break new ground as churches together in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean. Story, like memory, can be revolutionizing. And as I stand here this morning, many, many memories come rushing in to flood not just my mind, but my spirit and my soul too. I recall a little area in the yard in the car park just in front of the door of the now office, then the principal's residence, where Joanna used to play in front, and where Idris, Nolly, Clark, and I would sit on many an afternoon with cups of coffee or tea, sharing thoughts on matters of the day and dreaming for the future. And I recall Idris saying how envious desk-bound theologians in other places would be of that simple ritual of ours. A new model. Let's talk. Let's share. Let the theology arise, emerge. I recall the two of us, Idris and I, standing to the back of this building, looking down the backyard, and in the course of the conversation, Idris says to me, "Let's open a seminary in exile now." And by that he meant an institution that would provide the space for alternative thinking and creativity, something different from what the status quo establishes and what those establishments had on offer. He was dreaming. And we know well that's one of the signs of his spirit, certainly at Pentecost, that old men shall dream dreams and young men see visions. And he tried in several ways to implement what he saw as necessary in that way. He had, as Nolly mentioned, the Rural Leadership Program. He had the Reformed Deaconess Program, because he had in mind not persons to be sanctuary persons, but persons rather to be on the ground where the dispossessed were, the marginalized. And he was training these young women, a couple of whom are with us today, and who are a little older than they were at the time, and some of whom are now ministers of religion. And he had them trained in different areas, some in social work, one I think was in cooperatives, another in agriculture, organic agriculture, and so on. So that was the revised Deaconess Program. He also had, at the ecumenical level, seminars which he pulled together, and out of which have come certain documents which we cherish today. Two of those, Troubling of the Waters and Out of the Depths, breaking new ground, providing new thinking. I remember that when I was finished with my own postgraduate work in theology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, I donated to the library of New College in Edinburgh, my personal 2 copies, because I was determined to literally put on the shelf the issues of the Caribbean in other metropolitan centers. But had it not been for IDRIS and his initiative in that regard, I would not have had those 2 books to leave for the library in the University of Edinburgh's Faculty of Theology. The spot I have another funny one for you that I remembered. Again, in the back there where there were fruit trees, IDRIS caught a guy up in a fruit tree, one of the trees one afternoon. He said, "Hey, you, get down from there." Fella turned around and he told IDRIS, "This is Jar tree." IDRIS said, "Well, you know what? Tell Jar put a tree in your yard." But so there was that lighter, humorous dimension of him too. I also recall, not with sadness as such, but the spot in the car park where IDRIS and I had our last face-to-face interpersonal conversation. And that was just before he left for Toronto for his medical treatment. Our very last conversation actually took place on the telephone from the spot that is now, or was up to recently, the moderator's office, to his hospital bed in Toronto. It was during the Youth Work-Study Camp. That was an annual event. It was deliberately called by IDRIS Youth Work-Study because he was determined that young people must learn with and through their hands also and learn to contribute in that way. Many of the buildings were painted around here by those youth camps and so on. Randy would remember that. Not just to sit in the lecture room and do classes. So I had called to speak with him and to assure him that everything was okay. And because at that point I was effectively responsible for the particular camp. And I told him, "Don't worry about anything." And his last words to me were, "I am not worried." Those were the very last words that he would have said to me. That brings me to a personal point where IDRIS had a kind of trust and confidence in me as a young man that was sometimes frightening. He asked me to take on, to do lectures for the deaconesses and also for the young candidates for ministry at one stage in their formation. He also included me and made sure that I was rostered to do lectures for international meetings here. We had one annual meeting which was called Global Perspectives in Mission, and that brought people in from North America and Europe. And I never experienced any breathing down my neck or him standing around to hear what this young fellow was saying to the people. There was that kind of confidence. And the ultimate came when he asked me, almost on an day-to-day basis, just before the publication of what is now his swan song, his book that he published, he asked me to take home the transcripts. In those days, it was not computer. It was typewritten. So he would always give me with a warning, "Make sure you don't lose it, eh? Make sure you don't lose it." And I would take them home and read it. And interestingly, I saw at the end of when the book was published, that he duly acknowledged my contribution in his foreword. I'm saying that not just to highlight the relationship I had with IDRIS, but also to lift out the learning that we have to put a certain amount of confidence in young people if we are to carry our vision forward as church and as ecumenical community. There needs to be that kind of facilitating of younger people. So, outside of the compound, and this is my last experience that I'll share, I recall one particular conversation as we drove for quite a distance along the old Southern Main Road. I can't recall where exactly we were heading, but I do recall Idris driving, and as we drove, he shared his life story and journey with me from his childhood, very freely and openly. It was for me like a mystery unraveling in front of my eyes. And I want to say that the learning that I would get from this is that sharing our faith stories, both personal and as churches and as ecumenical institutions, will carry us a long way. We need to create what I call spaces of hospitality for such things to happen. And I want to, in a sense, challenge St. Andrew's Theological College to be open and ready and willing to be such a space for that kind of sharing to take place again. Idris's simplicity of life and his solidarity and identification with the dispossessed, the poor, the lonely was well known. And in that identification with those who were struggling for justice at different levels, I know that his family felt the consequences of that a couple times. I remember one occasion when they were all up and ready to go on vacation to a country house, I think it was, and something happened with one of the unions, either the Sugar Union or the OWTU, and Idris was being asked to come in as arbitrator, and that was the end of August vacation. And so that sacrifice was shared by his family, for which we are also grateful. In closing, I want to share with you some brief words that I received after I arrived here this morning from former Ambassador of Guyana to the European Union, Dr. Patrick P.I. Gomes, who was very active in the discussions as a sociologist and so on, and as a former Roman Catholic priest in all that was going on. In fact, he has a contribution in the book Out of the Depths. P.I. WhatsApped me, and I got this message in response to the link that I sent him last night. He said, "Oh, what a great person, visionary and committed to ecumenism, lasting legacy to build on." And as I close, I want to close with the words that I wrote several years ago when Idris had left us, and I wrote it on the brochure that we were planning our programs for that year. And I want to end by using these words. While mourning his passing, we celebrate his contributions. We thank God for his life, his love, his leadership, and his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Granado. And you referred to the seminary of St. John Vianney and the Uganda Martyrs, and also to the Ministry of Hospitality. And we have someone who represents both of those dimensions and is also speaking to us today from her perspective and the perspective of the Roman Catholic Church and the ecumenical movement, our sister, Nicole Poyer.
Good morning, siblings in Christ. Well, you need breakfast. Morning, neighbors. All right. So first of all, I am honored to be present here with you today, and I'm even more honored when I consider the fact that I never had the privilege of meeting Reverend HAMID. Never. But like so many who will tune in today and learn about this man who has gained legendary status, I have only heard about him, only read about him and his work. I have never met him. I have been asked to speak a bit about his ecumenical work and impact. And, well, firstly, I present myself as a testimony of his ecumenical work and impact. The fact that you have invited a Roman Catholic layperson to speak at the very theological institution where Idris HAMID served as principal from 1970 to 1981 is itself a testament to his ecumenical work and impact. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Yeah. The fact that I was able to begin my theological studies with the Sion Goodrich Theological Society under Nolly Clark, a colleague of Idris, is again a testament of Idris's ecumenical work and impact. The Conference in Theology in the Caribbean today, CTCT, celebrated 25 years in the year 2019. On that anniversary, His Grace the Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon, in an article in the Catholic News dated July 5th, 2019, says, "It is only in the 1970s that theologians came together through Dr. Idris HAMID to begin the awesome task of naming the contours of the God-human relationship in this region. That was short-lived because of the untimely death of Idris." Nothing is wasted with God, however. His Grace was speaking then about a space for theological reflection. What Idris and his colleagues began in the 1970s laid the foundation for what exists in Caribbean theology today. And again, as a testament to that, I present human beings as an example. The Conference in Theology in the Caribbean today, CTCT, came together again this year in June in Grenada. I was fortunate to attend, and so were one of your young people, Stephanie Baldeo Singh, and an intern minister, Namilia Lakshman Pulwati. Both Ms. Baldeo Singh and Mrs. Lakshman Pulwati gave powerful presentations, and I dare to say that Idris would have been proud of their work. Brothers and sisters, we would be doing a great disservice to Reverend HAMID, I think, if we attempted to reflect on his impact only through a formal theological lens. Yes, theological study and inquiry is important, and Dr. HAMID had a passion for education at all levels. When I speak with people who knew him well, however, they speak of Idris with a smile. That smile speaks to relationship. Bishop Clyde Harvey talks about Idris's self-sacrifice. I think at the heart of all that we will learn today, we will find that relationship. His relationship with the Most High and his relationship with his siblings on earth. In Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, Jacob Marley, in retort to Scrooge, says, "Mankind was my business, the common welfare my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop in the water, drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." Today, because we don't live in the 1800s, we will use inclusive language and say humankind is our business. It is clear to me that Idris and his colleagues understood this and applied it to all that they did. The theological reflections that came out of those Missology conferences in the 1970s had practical implications. They were an attempt to listen and speak in our own voice, to understand our own context, to lay the foundation for a pastoral praxis that would serve to unify the Caribbean church and bring her into deeper communion with God. In his paper entitled Caribbean Theological Perspectives, he says, "But our people have been doing theology. They have been living theology. The important and continuing task of doing theology is the mine is yet to be dug. And one is amazed again at its depth, at its profundity, its beauty. I dare to say that we are still amazed at the depth and beauty that we unearth when we venture to dig." Idris was a visionary, says Nolly Clark, and I think he's right. Here's the truth about visionaries, though. We don't like them. They confuse us, demand things of us, show us up. We can't see what they see. They are seldom, if ever, understood in their own time and by their own people. The path of a visionary is a lonely one. Often we speak of people being ahead of their time. A person who is ahead of their time exists, in a sense, out of time. Those of us present here today who look back on Idris's life and work can only try to understand the context in which he lived and worked and the cross he had to shoulder in order to be true to his vocation. We can easily take for granted the cost of his discipleship. But the fact is that people like Idris are often misunderstood and only appreciated after they are gone. At the end of the movie Alexander, old Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, says, "I never believed in his dream. None of us did." That's the truth of this life. The dreamers exhaust us. So what tends to happen after a visionary dies? For a time at least, the pendulum swings in the opposite direction. We not only fail to build on what they brought into being, often we frantically try to undo or bury. At the very least, we neglect what we should be nurturing. If we who are here today are to do justice to this exercise of looking at his life and work, then we must take the time to do two things. The first is to attempt to put ourselves in his shoes and understand his context. The second is to look objectively at our own context and see whether we are applying any of the tools that Idris left for us. We look back, we look at today in order to look forward. I think that it is very easy for us to look at things like Caribbean theology or ecumenism through a very narrow lens. And I think we would be missing some valuable opportunities to serve the people of God in doing so. Idris says in his Caribbean Theological Perspectives, when we talk about the effects and the consequences of the lives of our people, we offer the fellowship and the joy of the common life as church. If we are honest, we might be forced to admit that our understanding of church has shrunk, along with the size of our congregations. One of the occasions where I have been present to hear the question of why this is occurring, or where are they, those who are absent, the question is often posed in a manner that blames those who are not present. We do not ask if we were present to them in the way that they needed us to be. How common is this common life today? Last Friday, in talking about the image of a doubles vendor plying his trade in the midst of the flood, I don't know if you all saw that picture, there was this lone doubles vendor, and the absence of the politicians now that the elections were over. A lady whom I love said to me, "So one day walk go kill him?" My response, I don't know the man or his situation or anything like that, was, it's back to school season, and we're halfway through August. But that exchange, not for the first time, made me wonder if we as church are at all in tune with our people's daily struggle. How are we doing theology today? When we think of oikonomy, the root word of ecumenism meaning the whole inhabited earth, do we think only in terms of religion or faith traditions? Or can we broaden that to mean those whom we marginalize, perhaps without thinking? Isaiah 56:7 says, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." An ecumenical dream, not so? Yeah. Tell me, how many of our choirs can sing the songs that we sing at our regular worship? Are we really preaching the good news to all peoples? Are we really welcoming and including and empowering people to participate? The late Reverend Kendrick Suknarine and I had an ongoing conversation years ago about music and liturgy. His lament was that youth only wanted to sing the Hillsong stuff when there was youth service rather than the traditional music that he felt was more meaningful. We had a whole back and forth on it, and my short answer was the question, meaningful to whom? Very often what we consider meaning is our own emotional connection to the music based on what was happening and who we were when we learned it or when we began to come to an awareness of self. I am a child of the 80s. I still love rock music, and David Rudder can sing no wrong in my ears. Beethoven's Fuelis will forever make me think of my mother. While I understood his lament about the Hillsong stuff being an import, if we look objectively at the music he was talking about, those songs were an import too. What we really know about any driven snow here, right? If we're talking about white, maybe white as a young coconut jelly. Should we alienate our youth because they find meaning in a different place than we do? I suggest that the solution lies in formation. Form more people in Scripture, give them the tools to study, to meditate, to discern. Create a music foundation program that feeds the whole community, not just the people who come to service. And then encourage people to write their own music. There, we combine IDRIS's passion for ecumenism and formation, and I believe we'll hear so much fruit from that we'll have to rewrite the hymn books. Today, I can go to many churches across our Twin Island state and hear pan music as part of the normal liturgy. That wasn't always the case. Those seeds had to be planted and nurtured and protected. What are we planting today? The fact is that many of the programs that Idris started or was part of no longer exist today. Not in the way that he created them, nor bearing the names by which he would recognize them. What has happened, though, is that his thinking and doing has gone to seed, and we are seeing those fruits in all kinds of ways, organic to the time in which we find ourselves. Ecumenism seems to be struggling at the levels that we consider traditional. Yet the work of this college, the work of your sold-out servants, SOS, the work of the Conference of Theology, CTCT, all bear the seed of Idris's vision. How else can we look at all of this but with gratitude and reverence? Gratitude for the gift that was Idris Hamid, and reverence for the task before us of ensuring that the ripples that he started never stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, our sister Nicole Poyer. And you remind us, of course, of one of Reverend Hamid's continued emphasis on the dialectic between Christ and culture, where he talked about how we have to appreciate what is local, and it doesn't mean indigenizing everything or accepting everything that's local, but it means recognizing that just as Jesus used what was local at his time for his Last Supper, Many people would be offended today if we tried to have the Eucharist with, in his words, bake and coconut water or roti and sugarcane juice. And as we think about his work and as we think about that local emphasis, we hear from someone who, as Sondralyn and Joanna reminded me, was very influenced by the Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid, a former moderator of our church, former deaconess, someone who has been very versed in the life and work of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago and the contribution of the Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid. We are privileged to have with us today the Reverend Dr. Annabel Lala Ramkalawan. And at this time, we welcome her to share her thoughts and insights. Thank you.
Gerard, I assure you, I am not going to get in trouble today. Greetings to each and every one of you, and a pleasant good morning to those joining us on the virtual platform that we have today. We are gathered together to remember the life and the work of Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid. I would like to thank his family members for inviting me to be part of this seminar, and also the St. Andrew's Theological College, who is hosting this event. I feel very humbled to have been invited to speak here this morning. When I read the invitation letter and I saw the illustrious cadre of those who were going to speak this morning about the life and work of Dr. Idris Hamid, I said to myself, like the prophet Jeremiah, "Behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth." There is so much that can be said about Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid. But I have chosen this morning to speak of my memories and experience with Dr. Hamid as principal of the St. Andrew's Theological College. Having been accepted by the Synod of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago as a candidate for the new order of the deaconess in PCTT, I began my studies for this order in the church at S.A.T.C, St. Andrew's Theological College, for those of you who do not know the acronym. There, I met, or should say encountered, Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid and his family. Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid cared for his students, not only as a principal, but as a father. He and his family became the family of resident students here at S.A.T.C during our stay. There is an experience that displayed Dr. Hamid's fatherly care for his students that I have cherished over the years. And today, I wish to share this experience with you. In my very youthful years, I did not accept correction. criticisms and comments of my person. And anyone who dared tried was in for a bit of trouble. I never wanted to hear about my shortcomings. As far as I was concerned, I was the perfect individual. I would become angry and upset. Reverend Dr. Hamid was in tune with all his students, and he recognized my shortcoming. And I was summoned to the principal's office. Well, hallelujah. Lala, what trouble you get yourself in again? Being summoned to Dr. Hamid's office as principal meant you definitely did something wrong. And you were in for a stern disciplinary session. Well, I went, and I expected to get my disciplinary licking. So I humbled myself and I sat very quietly. Benitra sitting over the table and you on the next side, you better know who you're dealing with. In a very fatherly tone, in a very caring manner, he said to me, Annabelle, you mustn't get vexed and angry when persons tell you something about yourself. Well, I sit in there. I probably was turning red or green or blue or something. But I have to stay still. He's the authority. I'm the student. He continued, you must take time to see things through their eyes. You must see their point of view. You know, it's something that has never left my memory. In that little office over the courtyard, only Idris and I could have really fit in it, you know. It was real big. When someone or something is said, I have learned to stop, listen, assimilate, and see what someone is trying to say. Whether it is about my personality or whether it is about an issue we may have different opinions about. A colleague remarked, Rev, how you just sit down in that chair as moderator and no facial expression. Nobody know what you're thinking. But when you respond, you're right on the ball. Idris's words taught me that. Don't go into a fit. Don't be hurried to answer or defend yourself. Take time and listen, whatever it be. See it through their eyes. See what they see with their lens. And you know, I honestly think that discussion with Dr. Hamid impacted my life, and I am who I am today. I could take a criticism, I see it through you. It doesn't mean I agree with you, but I have learned to handle it well. Dr. Hamid was a passionate teacher. For most students who entered the doors of S.A.T.C, theology was a whole different world. It is a world that we knew nothing of. High school don't teach you anything except there was RI till they took it off the syllabus. It was a whole new dimension of education. At times, it was quite confusing when lecturers would use terms in our Old Testament history class, which was done by Mr. Pulchan Singh in those days and by Dr. Hamid. You hear a term coming out, tribal confederacy. Where is that? What are they talking about? Then you will hear about the monarchy of Israel. Words and phrases would fly to and fro. Dr. Hamid was also our lecturer for the prophets. His passion for the message of the prophetic books seemed to have rubbed off on his student. I don't think it have one single student who did the prophets under Dr. Hamid who has not been left with a passion for their message. Not only was he passionate in lecturing regarding the prophet and their thoughts, he showed it in his life. It was visible. The message of the prophets was visible in the life of Dr. Hamid. He struggled for justice. You heard Gerard made reference to the holiday was done for when the union called. He was in the melee, and I thought Mr. Pandey would have been here. They were all himself and Nolly Clark. They were in the melee and Bloody Tuesday in the coffee there, no? Next, the old man have boss head and thing. Justice was one of his mantras. He was always concerned about the underdogs in society, those who were exploited and those who were oppressed. Whenever something was happening in this country that took away the rights of people, and exploitation was mounting, and oppression was pushing at people, bet your bottom dollar Dr. Idris Hamid was right there. He consistently called individuals to return to their spiritual lives. Not return to this religion or that religion, you know. Return to your spiritual walk and journey. He was a prophet of his time. One of Idris's mantras was, do not slump into intellectual laziness. The first time he used that phrase in the upstairs hall there, we were in a class on homiletics, and we were doing our practice preaching. And when the student was finished, one of my colleagues, but they didn't complete the journey, he says, you are intellectually lazy. Okay. At the time, we didn't understand what Idris was saying, you know. He was telling us and the presenter, you did no research work, no time was spent preparing that. And he would always say to us, do not become intellectually lazy. Strive to reach your full potential. A mantra that I believed has propelled me onward in my academic journey. And today I publicly say, thank you, Dr. HAMID, for implanting in us your mantra, do not be intellectually lazy, and strive to be your full potential. Through Dr. HAMID's involvement with the ecumenical movement, students of S.A.T.C at that time were exposed to international gatherings held at S.A.T.C to discuss and to develop ecumenism. Brother Granado spoke of that. Those were wonderful days here at S.A.T.C. Like every 6 months, we have foreigners on this hill, man, from all over the world. When one of my colleagues, Deaconess Lucy, went to do her social work program in what today we are calling organic farming in Japan, she sent me a photograph of myself. And I wondered, where on earth Lucy get this photo? This photo was taken in Tobago when we had persons at S.A.T.C for an ecumenical gathering. She writes in the letter, we didn't have Zoom and Skype and WhatsApp. In the letter she wrote, she said she went to dinner at the home of an individual, and there on his space saver was my photograph. So she asked for a copy. Today it is on my space saver because it has such memories. That was taken in Tobago when we went to Tobago with a group that came to Trinidad. Jerry, we couldn't come home the night. No flights to come home. The Anglicans hosted us that night. Ecumenism even take us around the world, and pictures are around the world of Reverend. Well, then I was Deaconess Lala, and someone sends it to me and said, but where she get this? You know, the ecumenism that student of the day was availed, opened our eyes beyond Presbyterianism and Catholicism and Anglicanism. We saw the world in a whole new dimension, and the mission of the church in a whole new dimension. In those days, every young theological mind dreamt of the day they will attend Bossy Ecumenical Institute in Geneva, because ecumenism was the trend of theology at the time that attracted. So, all because of Dr. HAMID, we were exposed to this theology and this new vision of seeing church and ministry. The sudden passing of Reverend Dr. HAMID, I was in my final few months to go to Jamaica to do my social work program together with Reverend Sharma. We were deaconesses being sent to Jamaica to do a social work program to equip us for the deaconess order. Dr. HAMID passed. Well, it's like Daddy gone. Our theological father is gone. It created a void in the hearts of all his students at S.A.T.C. and by extension, the international community of theologians. Not only PCTT lost that day, but international theological thinkers lost a brother. The impact of the life of Reverend Dr. HAMID on the students placed under his care at S.A.T.C. can be seen in their passion for their ministry. The moral and ethical values by which they live and their constant concern for those in need. I am very grateful to the family of Reverend Dr. IDRIS HAMID for sharing with the students of S.A.T.C. books from Dr. HAMID's personal library. We had first choice, and we thank you. Then, we were not well developed in the theological world to value some of the books being offered to us. We were still babies in theology. But in 2010, when I had to write a paper for admission into my master's program at Western Theological Seminary, I was asked to write on the theologian that impacted me the most. And there was volume 1, 2, and 3 of Paul Tillich, Systematic Theology. It took years until the value of that 3-volume Paul Tillich. All you know who is Paul Tillich? That is a great, great theological mind along with Bonhoeffer. Those were names thrown at us. We didn't know. But in 2010, when I had to write the paper, who is the theologian that has impacted me most? I said, look, I go look real bright if I write about Paul Tillich. And there was I reading those books again. And IDRIS had underlined, marked things in his book and put little red X. So reading it for the first time years ago was easy. To prepare the paper was even easier because IDRIS had done some of the work for me. I must say that I hope one day I can share my library with students at S.A.T.C. I know all you have electronic books. Some of it doesn't carry all the pages, right? But a book is something to be cherished. Sondra and Joanna, I will cherish the years we spent, myself, Reverend Sharma, and the others, here at S.A.T.C. We were an extended family. The memories of Dr. HAMID can never be erased. He wasn't even here to see the setting apart of his new age deaconesses, nor was he able to see the fruits of his labor. He is among the great cloud of witnesses today And I am sure he's looking down at us and saying, I feel proud of you girls today. Thank you. And I want to end with, I could speak on and on about Dr. HAMID. I had some photos, but I didn't know we were going to have photos on display. But I will try to scan and share with the HAMID family. Anna, you remember the birthday party in Curep? We have some lovely photos from that with him and Reverend Kramer. Dr. HAMID was a man beyond his time. A man way beyond his time. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for allowing me to share.
So grateful to the Reverend Dr. Annabelle Lala Ramkilawan. Grateful for sharing your memories as a student. And yes, there's so many things that Reverend HAMID did, so many people whose lives he impacted. And one of the reasons it's so important for us to have this is that so many of the people he impacted are no longer with us or are not very well. So our former Prime Minister, Bastille Pandey, is not very well, and that's why he couldn't join us today. But he sent these words that he had written before. Dr. HAMID was one of those persons of the cloth who understood the inseparable link between the struggles for physical as well as moral and spiritual well-being. And we think of that in what Reverend Dr. Annabelle Lala Ramkilawan described as this kind of embracing ministry, being a father figure to the students, as well as such a great intellectual, a caring person, as well as a thinking person. And we have Reverend Ken Kalu with us, the archivist of our church, and someone who knew Reverend HAMID as well. And at this time, we invite Reverend Kalu to share with us your thoughts and memories and insights on Reverend HAMID. Reverend Ken Kalu. Reverend Kalu is joined by the assistant archivist of our church, Mr. Sibu, known to many people as Uncle Bill. Anything you're comfortable with, you're welcome to stand here. Try to stand it up. Sure. You can spread out things. Sure.
Am I the last speaker?
Yes. No, it's Joanne. She's just right.
Yes, right.
Yes, Joanne. You're the last. Built up to you.
Thank you very much. Let's get back to our seats now. Yeah, this is all. Ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all greet you with a Kaisan Hal and a Assalamu Alaikum and a Como está usted? And a Como vous allez-vous? And how are you going? Are you going good? And you're enjoying yourself? And you're giving my bongs? That's the way to go. They say it's always a wise thing to begin at the beginning. Let me start in the context of this seminar. Let me start at the beginning. I entered St. Andrew's Theological College in January of 1957. I had just completed 5 glorious years at Queen's Royal College. Thank you, mates. The thing about it being at Queen's Royal College, I spent 5 years there and I learned nothing. It is a wonder when I said I would enter enter the ministry, that I was accepted as a transfer student to Naparima College to do A-levels, because that's the way to go. And so I did. And I came to Paradise January 7th, 1957, and I was met by a dozen ruffians. They were called theologians, theological students. But in truth and in fact, they were real buggers, you know. The first thing they did was to make me kneel down and christen me with all kinds of names that I bear up to the present time. There were 12 students. We had 6 study bedrooms upstairs in the building there. 6 theological ruffians. And they became the closest of friends. There were 12 of us. And I think for the year that we spent together, for the 7 months, because some of them went off to Canada afterwards, I think all of us secretly wondered which one was Judas. Well, we never quite found out that. So I entered S.A.T.C. 1957. Great experience. I learned all kinds of stupidness and all kinds of wonderments. And I met glorious people, and I met scams. That was the best theological education I had. In all the institutions I went to, St. Andrew's, founded in 1892. And by the way, St. Andrew's, still standing today, is the oldest tertiary institution in Trinidad, and still going strong. These 12 miserable people, we became the best of friends, the closest companions. And later on in the year, around August, September, we had a visiting student who was searching and looking and finding. In around August, September, 1957, Idris Hamid walked into our lives. Within a few weeks, he used to come up there to visit the principal, Reverend Ed Newberry, to have talks concerning the ministry. And he would come over in the college, and we got to know one another. But somehow or the other, in subsequent weeks and months, he made a beeline for my study bedroom. And we would talk about all kinds of things. He would ask me questions, and I would answer. Remember, I was a theological student. He wasn't. And he asked wonderful questions. And I gave even more wonderful answers. And all of it was pure rubbish. But he was asking questions. And we discovered each other. One day we were talking downstairs in the chapel, and he noticed the ping pong table. And we talked about sports. And by the way, the 5 years I spent at QRC was devoted to sports. Huh? And Idris, well, let's play a game. And I discovered that he was one of the better players. He took me to task. And I thought I was pretty good. And in a sense, that cemented our friendship. Because not only did he play table tennis, he played cricket. Later on, when he became principal of St. Andrew's Theological College, he had a cricket team of the fellas, you know. And they would ask me to come and wicket keep for the college because, you know, they didn't have a wicket keeper. And then later on, I discovered that he could swim. And not only swim, I remember as young theologues, young ministers later on, we had a Monday, once a month Monday meeting with all the young ministers. And we'd go to the different beaches. And Idris was in the group, of course. And you know, this fellow would swim out when we went to Tobago one day. He would swim out beyond the breakers. Not me. If I reach ankle-high water, I happy to bad. You know, he was that kind of fellow. But to get back to the theology part of it, he would ask me questions that I couldn't answer. I couldn't even venture to think about. Once he asked me about salvation. Tell me, what do I know about salvation? Yes, I went to church every day of my life from babyhood, like many of us. I went to a Presbyterian primary school. I went Sunday school. I went youth club, Christian Endeavor, you name it. Christian Endeavor, youth club. I was in the Nazarene church Friday nights only for about 5 or 7 years because Junior Miller, the son of the Nazarene minister, was my best friend. And Peter Newberry, the son of Ed Newberry at St. Andrews, joined our group coming from San Fernando. And for years, we had the Triple Star Club. But I didn't know any theology. But we talked, and Idris used to ask all kinds of questions. And you know, friends, what I found out? Idris came from a strong Islamic family. Yes, he went for his primary schooling at the Waterloo Presbyterian School, out there around in Chaguanas, Waterloo and so on. And then he passed his exhibition exam. Same exam I wrote in the early 1950s and so on, exhibition. And he went to Fatima College. Funny thing that, he went to Fatima College. I was at QRC, we're about 5 years or 6 years difference. But you know where Fatima College is? On Bucarapu Street. And the back of Naprima College is Francis Law Street. And Francis Law Street was the back of Woodbrook Presbyterian Church and the Manse. And yet we never met. But I used to be in Fatima College all the time. All my friends at church went to Fatima College. I went to QRC. I would go over there to practice in their nets and so on. And yet we never met. But the mere fact that, he went there and I went there meant something. Worse than that. Many years later, I found out that Idris could swim. You talk about swim, you talk about ping pong. I see Joanna here in front, Let me give you this joke about us. Joanna and I taught for several years at IDRIS High School. And one of the great pastimes in IDRIS was table tennis. And of course, as one of us who liked to play, I used to play with the students. And it was great fun. But it was greater fun when Joanna arrived. Because boy, like her dad, she was simply great. Students used to hang around and miss my best shots, whether the flick or the slam, forehand slam. Joanna would go backwards, step backwards, and in a very stylish way. She had a great impact upon the students. You could tell. Idris was that kind of person. He asked me stupid questions, my interpretation, but he was searching for something. And in our talks in my study bedroom, I learned the story. After Fatima College, he went to Pres San Fernando to do A-levels. He was a bright fellow. He did well enough to land a good job with Shell Point Fortin. He worked there for 5 or 6 or 7 years. And the story he told is that he attended evangelical service at one of these Pentecostal tent meetings. And Idris was converted. Now that's an astonishing thing, Idris came from a strong, well-respected Islamic family. Idris was converted. He was Islamic. He went to a Presbyterian school for his primary school education. How much Presbyterianism rubbed off on him in those years, I doubt very much. Maybe he could sing Jesus Loved Me, This I Know, and so on. He went to Pres Fatima College. I know the college well. I know a lot of the prefects there well. When I say prefects, the young priests from Ireland who came out. He went to Pres San Fernando. On one side was Naprima Girls High School, on the other side was Susumacha. I don't know how much rubbed off on him because of that. But after his conversion, and stayed in the Pentecostal church for a little while. He met up with a Presbyterian family, or families. The name George Salick comes to my mind because he was the principal of Chandernagore Presbyterian School. One of my brothers taught with Mr. Salick. And he came into contact with the Presbyterian Church, and he, 1957, came up on Paradise Hill. You know, dear people, they say God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. As far as I'm concerned in my life, that was one of the wonders. Idris and I got to know each other pretty well. You know, in reading the Bible stories, you know, take sports. Sports is a big thing in my life. But I believe, you know, that Jesus used to run on the beach, training for the marathon of life. You know, I believe that Jesus was a swimmer and he could beat any comers. And he was on the boat ready to save his fellow disciples, even if he had to swim them out of danger. A Waterloo boy, Islamic background, and he was converted. I'm not going to talk very long. I made copious notes, but I'm not going to read notes. Idris was accepted for our ministry, Presbyterian Church I'm talking about. In our Presbyterian Church, to become a theological college student, you had to be a member of your church, you had to apply to the session, that is to the elders and so on. They will interview you, they'll recommend you to the college, and the college will take it from there if they find you suitable and acceptable. But Idris was working in Pontfortin Idris. He didn't belong to a Presbyterian church. So the solution, it makes me smile. The solution was found because next door was the Oroput region, Faizabad, Rosilak. And they accepted one who was, in a sense, a stranger in the church. And he was recommended to become a theological college student. So in the records of the Oroput people, there are so far 4 ministerial candidates: Jeff Elder, Emerson Mailalsing, Idris Hamid, and Robert Dinu. I think Robert is somewhere around. Idris came from nowhere. He was adopted by Oroput, and he came to St. Andrew's Theological College. You know, I was a student at St. Andrew's for 3 years. Idris wasn't even a student. He used to come up on weekends and play ping pong. We went to Jamaica in '57. Idris proceeded to Canada, 1958. You know, friends, from all that I've heard this morning, and much of which I know, people would say that Idris was a Troark. a throwback to the old prophetic line of development. But Idris wasn't a throwback at all. Idris was a throw forward. He was born out of his time. You see, I have made about 10 pages of notes here, but all that is rubbish. I worked with Idris when I was a minister. I even acted as principal for 1 year when Idris was off doing his masters and so on. And one thing I can tell you, that he was ahead of his time. You know why? He walked with God, huh? He walked with Jesus every day. I used to watch Idris striding up and down in front of the theological college, walking up and down. That wasn't my style. That was Idris' style, but I'll never forget. Head bowed, shoulders hunched, and he's walking up and down, up and down, up and down. And he would send me little notes and so on. It was like Hebrew to me because he couldn't write, like myself. We had, what you call it, crap-o-foot writing. You know, friends, talking about old friend like Idris, you know, you reflect upon your own life and where we have come from and where we are going. You see, when Idris 1 year as a student in Canada, he came back to Trinidad to do a summer's vacation work in Trinidad. And they appointed him to go back down to Point. And he must have met a missionary pastor there by the name of Roy Jordison. Now, Roy Jordison was a crazy man. He set up 7 churches down in that peninsula. John Morton in the 1860s and 70s went out there to start a mission, but he couldn't do it. He was only one man. And nothing was done down there until Roy Jordison came. And Idris went down there to help him. He was appointed down there. You know, the stories that came out of that is amazing. Jordison was the man. I knew him well. When I was in college, living in college, he lived at Laissez-Faire, and he used to come up on the hill. Roy Jordison would take 6 or 7 services every Sunday. He used to drive like a crazy man. And when he was tired, you know what Roy Jordison would do? He would park up under a tree and sleep for 10 or 15 minutes and then keep going. That's the most astonishing thing that I've ever heard. A stranger in the country, a white man, park up under a wayside tree, sleeping. Lucky thing it was then and not now. And I believe, I have no proof of this, but I believe that Roy Jordison had something to do with Idris HAMID. His whole outlook in life, his passion in the work that he did. Let me tell you, give you a little joke. We had this little group of young ministers. We used to meet We tried to meet every Monday. You know, in those days, Mondays was the minister's day off, or it's supposed to be the minister's day off. Monday was people's Sunday. Cool yourself. And we used to meet in this church office, and we would go over in Soongs and have a bowl of soup, something like that. And then we started making a little lime down on a beach once a month or so. We called ourselves Habura. Habura. Habura is the Hebrew word for fellowship. And we used to go, and I told you we went Tobago one day, and Idris used to swim out in the thing. And the next time we had a meeting on the hill with all the ministers, the young fellas in one group, and then Rohini Hall, Cyril Bihari, Jim Sunarayan, and all them fellas lying by themselves. And we went up to them and tell them, why don't you fellas come and join us on a Monday and let us have a nice quiet day of rest and talk and get to know each other and so on. And so on. It sounds very good. And I'll never forget Rohini Hall saying to us, he said, if you fellas continue to do that, 3 or 4 cars of ministers, and there was a terrible accident, we have to close down the Presbyterian church immediately. Now, I don't even know what the point I'm trying to say. But the point is, you see, sticking together, being together, doing things together is critical. But there comes a time when you have to do things by yourself. And it is between me and God, and you and Jesus, in all that we do. We could talk how much theology that we want. We could spout all kinds of things that we want. But you know, in my knowledge of Idris from 1957 to 1981, he kept it simple. He kept it between himself and the good Lord. We had a great fellowship. We had a great friendship. We disagreed on some things. For example, in the choice of theological college students and so on. We had serious discussions about them kinds of things. But one thing I must say, it never, ever interrupted our friendship. It never, ever interrupted the friendship that we built up in those years. I leave you with a picture of a man then. You know, he wasn't a throwback. He was a throw forward. Idris was in search of new perspectives. And I leave that thought with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Ken Kalu. And now among family today is the family of Reverend Dr. Idris HAMID. We're so happy to have Sondralyn and Joanna here. And at this time, Joanna will share with us.
So I am Joanna, and my contribution is that of a child reflecting on her father. So that's my disclaimer. This is not an academic presentation. I am the youngest of the 4 children of Idris and Carolyn HAMID. When Reverend Adrian asked me to deliver this short presentation, I reminded him that I was only 15 years old when my father passed away. So my memories of him only span a mere 11 to 12 years and are the memories of a child. I, as an adult, did not know my father. However, having given the request more serious consideration, I conceded, as I do acknowledge that much of my thinking in my adult life has been shaped by my father. I would like to share some of the most indelible memories of my father. And some of these perhaps would only be known by me and my siblings. Daddy took a lively interest in our development, our school life, and recreational activities. Although he was an extremely busy person, we were fortunate that Daddy's official workplace was always right next door. As a minister's family, we resided either in a manse or a home attached to his workplace, such as these former homes on this hill. And so we were never far physically from him. We would often play and run in and out of the office in our daily activities as children. So a couple interesting facts about Daddy. Daddy was a lover of science. He believed in science, and he saw science in everything around him. For those of you who may not have known, Daddy completed a BSc in Physics and Life Sciences at the University of Toronto. A first degree was a prerequisite to the Bachelor of Divinity program at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. He had studied math, physics, chemistry, and biology at higher certificate level at Presbyterian College. And upon graduation from high school, he held jobs at the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture and as a trainee engineer at Shell in Point Fortin. It was around this time he had his conversion experience and had a complete change in the trajectory of his career. His love of science manifested itself in his explanation to us children, the science behind everything. How the body worked, how planes flew, how the earth moved, everything. And he lived it too. Once there was an eclipse of the sun at midday, and he built the necessary contraption to enable us to view the spectacle. In the 1970s, we had a hydroponic garden in our yard, constructed by Daddy. He even volunteered to teach biology at Napriema College if a teacher was absent. He wanted all his children to pursue science and was very alarmed when my elder sister announced she was accepted to do languages at university. She recalls Daddy encouraging her to pursue instead a career in medicine so that she could devote her life to helping and healing. Another fun fact about Daddy, and we did hear about it, was his love for sports, and in particular swimming and the sea. This meant that every vacation we would spend a few weeks at either Mayaro, Manzanilla, Toko, or Kumana. He loved everything about the sea and taught us how to swim and ride the waves. And because of him, we were brave and fearless in the water. He purchased snorkel gear for us and taught us how to explore the coastlines of this island that he loved. He would have his fishing gear in hand, ready to throw a line off the rocks in Toko. I also recall on these trips, he visited the manses along the way and introduced us to the priests and the pastors of the churches in the area. Right here in front of this college, he taught us all how to ride bikes and play badminton. There were always table tennis boards on this hill, and whenever we approached him with a table tennis racket or a badminton racket in hand, he was always willing to spare 2 minutes of his busy schedule to challenge us to a game. During our school vacations, he invited all our cousins to join us. And to this day, we still reminisce about these times together. And as I mentioned, cousins, I need to add that Daddy was extremely committed to family, both his and my mother's, knowing them, meeting them, seeking out extended families, dropping in to see them anytime he could. Daddy always made sure that we kept abreast of the current happenings in the country. So every carnival, we trekked to Port of Spain to see Mass. and he and my mother would attend the Calypso tents because he believed that Calypso was social commentary. He was interested in the everyday lives of people and wanted to stay in tune with their day-to-day struggles. As children, we were probably never fully cognizant of the implications of the slogans that were buzzwords in our home. Free the soldiers, Texaco must go, houses before horses, peace, bread, and justice. But we knew they were significant to him. Daddy was an avid reader, reading any subject matter and delving deep into those areas of interest to him. As a result of this, our homes always had a dedicated library space, not much smaller than the public library. And as this overflowed, his books filled any available space in the house, much to my mother's dismay. In addition to our memories of him in his role as a father, the other memories we all have of Daddy were those we experienced in the backseat of the car with him as the driver, both literally and figuratively. We were first-hand witnesses to his work life. Daddy thought it important to comment on the issues of the day, so we often frequented the offices of the Guardian and Express newspaper to deliver his letters to the editor. Over the years, he wrote numerous articles on evolving issues such as family planning, the national lottery, housing, horse racing, the plight of sugar workers, just to name a few. When he was principal of the St. Andrew's Theological College for that 11-year period, and we lived on the hill, I remember the hill always buzzing with activity. At this time, some of the theological students and deaconesses living on the hill came not only from Trinidad, but they came from Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Guyana, and even Bonaire. Daddy also welcomed non-theological students who found a home here in the dorms to attend nearby high schools, unable to afford the commute from their remote villages into San Fernando. And we hold very fond memories of this community of students who became our extended family on the hill. And I see Annabelle and Anna Sharma, and they know what I'm talking about. When the Caribbean Ecumenical Program was started, this introduced another dimension to life on the hill. With the many conferences held here, I was a child, I wasn't too sure what they were talking about. We as children were always excited to meet the persons from around the Caribbean and the world. I recall a particular conference called the International Conference of Sugar Workers, the first of its kind in the world, where persons came from as far as Papua New Guinea, Mauritius, and the Fiji Islands. And to this day, we still have the little souvenirs they gave us. My father always found a way to get things done. I recall the year, and I'm not too sure why, that he decided that the Caribbean Lenten booklet would be printed right here in this room. And that it did. He acquired a printer, and the students of the college and us kids walked around in circles assembling the pages and stapling the end product for distribution. My older siblings assisted Daddy in proofreading, although that may have been his way of getting them to read something of substance. My father was a man of the cloth, believing deeply in the teachings of the Bible and his church, and delivering the message of Jesus. But he put his bucket down among the working class, the poor and the downtrodden, who he felt were worthy of this message too. His deep concern for people led to the formation of Rural Aid, which he incorporated into the work of the college and the Deaconess program. As children, we would often go with him to the villages where the program was implemented, Retrench, Brickfield, Taruba. My older siblings still just teenagers, were charged with the responsibility of teaching Sunday school at Retrench, a village consisting mostly of squatters. In addition, my older sister was given receptionist duties at the makeshift medical clinic set up at Retrench Church for the residents of the village on a Sunday evening. Daddy recruited from his acquaintances in the medical fraternity these volunteer services. We accompanied Daddy to these villages we had never heard of before and entered the homes of its families, seeing lives quite remote from what we knew. Many lessons were learned, especially the meaning of the expression, to live on the train line. We saw over time in Retrench a community developed where there was none before. Where there was once abject poverty, there was now employment generated. Women equipped with sewing machines gaining financial independence. Children clothed and readied for school and attending church on a Sunday. Some of the villagers were even employed on this hill for the smooth running of the conferences. My father was invited and attended many conferences around the world and lectured at UTC in Jamaica and the University of Toronto. His traveling, although taking him away from home, was fun for us as children, and we looked forward to the postcards that we would receive and the gifts upon his return home. As much as he traveled and was exposed to many other worlds, and having attained all his tertiary education in Canada and the US, Daddy was a Caribbean man. He remained true to his country and his region and his Caribbean identity. For his clergy wear, I remember he asked my mother to design and sew a combined style of a kurta and a shirt jack, calling it a kurta jack, with a small cross embroidered on it. He felt that this was more fitting for a Caribbean preacher. I recall that he believed that communion served in our church should have been sada roti and sorrel instead of bread and grape juice or wine, and once served it for communion at the college. I recall my father also being offered a position at WCC, World Council of Churches, to work and live in Geneva, a life that would have taken him and us away from the tumult of the church, who did not always support and approve of his methodologies, but he insisted that he wanted to serve his people here. Our father's life was always about people, and this is how I remember him the most. People always came to see him and would spend long hours chatting on the bench in front of our house. And of course, we as children would have to offer them passion fruit juice and sometimes dinner. As a child, I did not always know who these people were, and only when I entered adulthood, I recognized them and understood that they were his colleagues along the journey dedicated to improving the lives of mankind. Like minds attract like minds. And so his colleagues were often clergymen from other denominations, community activists, as well as political figures who shared his deep passion for improving people's life. We came to know them well. One such person was George Weeks, who was my father's friend and ally. They were comrades in the battle for peace, bread, and justice. Mr. Weeks stated that he met Daddy when he was detained in prison and saw the newspaper with a photo of Daddy holding candles at a vigil he had organized campaigning for Mr. Weeks' release. When he was eventually released from prison, he and Daddy became friends. Their friendship continued, and Daddy became a supporter of the oil field workers and their plights. He shared a similar relationship with the all sugar and general workers and often wrote in a newspaper about the unjust treatment of sugar workers in this country and lent support and a voice when he could. This earned him the nickname the political priest. Whenever there was a crisis in Trinidad, Daddy was there, with us in the back seat, listening to the fishermen when a storm battered their boats at King's Wharf, when police broke down the homes of squatters, when workers were marching for their rights. I remember him being in the front line of the infamous Bloody Tuesday March of 1975, where he, in the front line, arm in arm with the union leaders and activists of the day, marched on Coffee Street for the rights of workers. There was a heavy police presence, and I recall him describing to us having to scale the walls of Susumacha Church to seek cover from the tear gas. He was slightly injured during this event, having been beaten by the police, and I recall the many visitors to our home that evening who came to lend their support. The conservative church he belonged to may have found his actions radical and questioned what business he had in politics and the unions. But many others valued his involvement as he bridged the gap between the pulpit and the people. Daddy's concern was always for the disenfranchised, helping them put their lives together, helping them build their homes, guiding their educational placement, their vocation, giving them a purpose and a fighting chance in a world that he felt left them behind. He supported every cause where he thought people were unjustly treated. This was the life my father lived, and we saw it firsthand. As children of a minister, we may have known less of the Bible and more of a life in service to mankind. Daddy was intelligent but down to earth, courageous and outspoken. He lived a life of conviction, even if it bordered on radicalism. His tenacity to get things done, to stir new thoughts and ideas, to write and publish, to create new programs, to contribute and influence society was, in my mind, immeasurable. To close my contribution today, I wanted to put into context the following. As children, you think of your parents as ancient. But as I myself grew older and became an adult, I realized just how young my father was when I knew him and throughout all the contributions of his life. He was married at age 24 and had 4 children by the age of 31, ordained as a minister at the age of 28. He became the moderator of the PCTT at the age of 31, began his tenure at St. Andrew's College at 35, wrote the widely known booklet In Search of New Perspectives at the age of 35, edited 3 or 4 books, contributed to countless writings, published his thesis, History of the Presbyterian Church, at the age of 44. My father passed away suddenly at the ripe old age of 46. My mother chose wisely the words for Daddy's headstone. Life's true measure is not in its duration, but rather in its donation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I know Joanna was quite concerned she would have been too emotional to deliver her very profound and powerful words, so we are grateful you were able to share those with us. Thank you. And also impacted by the Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid and delivering some remarks and a prayer for the blessing on the refreshments is the former principal of St. Andrew's Theological College, the Reverend Dr. Randall Sama.
very much. I will be very brief. Good morning, dear friends. It's so nice to see all of you here, and especially dear old friends from the HAMID era. Yes, David, I'm talking about you. I shall be very brief. The predecessor speakers took large chunks of what I wanted to say, and I thank you for that. It makes my job easier. So, leaving high school, starting to teach, I heard this sense of call, and it is in talking to IDRIS that I began classes here in 1977, what was called the weekend program. And everybody, theological students and lay students, were part of that exercise. As Annabelle said, deaconess training and pre-theological training took place. The ministerial students went off to either Jamaica, and some completed at St. John Vianney. Out of this experience with Reverend HAMID, and I do believe he did take a personal interest in my journey, I was able to go to Cuba, and the whole thing of communist Cuba and all those sorts of things in 1978, I think it was, for a festival of youth and students. So that was an experience, seeing Fidel Castro quarter mile away in a big stadium. And the other significant experience, in 1981, the college was blessed with a husband and wife team from the Naramata Center. It's a United Church camp way out in British Columbia. And they invited me to come. So upon graduation from Teachers College, my first trip to Canada was across Canada to British Columbia to work on this camp. Every week was a different group of people coming in and so on. And that, I think, inspired me to pursue Christian education. But that was the time Idris died. I was way out there, and it was Reverend Baldeo, one of our great ministers, who visited Naramata. He didn't live too far away, and broke the news to me. And then, surprisingly, visiting your mom, Sandra and Joe, it is your mother that gave me an Emmanuel College brochure, and the rest is history. In terms of the college, this hill has a lot of history. As former speaker said, the formation of the Caribbean Conference of Churches, the Caribbean Ecumenical Program, and for Mr. Ward and Danny, where Michael's office is presently, that is where the Caribbean Ecumenical Program office was. And it is there I met Jerry Granado. He did omit to say that his time here, he got a free paying job on his car. But we won't go into that. It was very controversial. But Idris put across to us the whole thing about social justice. And I believe his training at the United Church of Canada seminaries led him to have this social conscience. As students of the college, it was required reading to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and the whole thing about conscientization. In terms of youth, it was obvious that Idris had a deep passion for young people and their theological formation. So everybody knows about Board of Youth Affairs today. Board of Youth Affairs came about around the the early 1990s. But before that was the Synod Youth Committee. And Reverend Kenrick Suknarayan was chairperson of that. And I remember going to Marabella Manse to have meetings. But before that, the youth work of the church was an arm of St. Andrew's Theological College. So we recognize then that Mr. Milton Sibu was the first youth coordinator, okay? And he had a little Vauxhall too, I think. And then David Maulabach succeeded him when Milton got other employment. But one of the good things about then is that throughout the year, there were several weekend experiences for young people on theological reflection and formation and so on. And yes, the whole thing about justice and the prophets and so on, and those were good times, good times. So out of all of this came the Presbyterian Youth Camp and Caribbean Ecumenical Youth Camp, and a lot has been said about that. Kenrick used to tell us many times, and it's quite sad he's not here with us today. He said, Idris may not agree with what you're saying, but he would listen to you. And two quotations. Joanna, can you bring my phone, please? That's not the quote, but I just... Two quotations that stay with us, or should stay with all of us. And these two quotations were often on the pamphlets printed at the college. Idris used to tell us, the ill-equipped Christian is an embarrassment to Christ. The ill-equipped Christians is an embarrassment to Christ. And then he also used to say, you don't have to be a minister to minister. Permit me to read some brief remarks from Lucy Mahabia. Annabelle mentioned her name. Lucy was the one who went to Japan to study agriculture. And a gentleman saw her and he started to study marriage. So, you know how these things work. And recently, Lucy became a grandmother. So this is what Lucy has to say. And I know Lucy is watching. Reverend Hamid's vision and commitment to start training deaconesses locally, I think before they went Jamaica as well, made it possible for me to enter S.A.T.C, first as a weekend student, and then as a full-time student for the deaconess ministry. In the short space of time that I came to know Reverend Hamid, I can say he had a great motivation and passion for the marginalized in the rural sugarcane communities in South Trinidad. Thus, the creation, I believe, of the Rural Lead program, where I was trained to assist social workers in these communities, Taruba, Waterloo, Brickfield, Retrench, and it's quite sad to see how the Retrench Church is now, and also Puna. Visiting and getting to know the families and needs of the communities, and bringing in talented people to hold workshops and train the mothers especially to do little handicraft and cooking skills and so on, so that they could earn a living, and even start in kindergarten schools. So home economics, home management were taught and so on. But one of the great impacts Idris left with me was a knowledge of the great need for ecumenism in the Caribbean. And it was titled Caribbean Theology. I recall the small office at the S.A.T.C compound, always bustling with representatives from different churches and different regions and so on, North America, Pacific, Europe, just to mention a few. I recall the German representatives asking concrete, practical questions. Lecturers like Mr. Gerard Granado, Canon Nolly Clark, Dr. Brinsley Samaru, and a long list of professionals lectured and prepared workshops. CCC was the Caribbean Theology's umbrella, and Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid is saying to us through this memorial that there is still a vision, still a hope, and still an insight to our own understanding of a unique Caribbean culture and theology if we would only embrace it and come together and support it together. There is one faith, one Lord, one baptism. In memory of Idris Hamid. Thank you. So I now ask us to stand for the blessing of the meal. Father, as we gather together, let our friendships grow around the table. So bless this meal and sanctify this meal to give us nourishment in body, mind, and spirit. May this meal strengthen us to serve you through our various callings in life. Bless the hands that prepared it, and may all our lives and the blessings that come through our lives help us to work for the kingdom that is to come. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Sama. Please be seated. And I know many of you have your own memories of Reverend Dr. Idris Hamid, and if we were to share them, we'd be here for many, many years. Several people sent in their memories. I'm grateful that Reverend Sama shared the memories from Deaconess Lucy Mahabir. Other people remember Reverend Hamid and his ministry, and they said when he was their minister, there was no crime in their area because Reverend Hamid would get all the, to use Reverend Kalu's words, all the ruffians from the area and tell them, come play cricket. You think you can play cricket? Come play cricket. And all the ruffians would not have time for crime because they were too busy trying to beat each other in cricket. Someone else shared their memory of a homiletics class where Reverend Hamid told them to prepare a sermon as though they were delivering it to a certain congregation. And when they began preaching, Reverend Hamid told them, now remember, preach your sermon so that the smallest child who hasn't been to school could understand what you're saying. So these are some of the many memories people have of him, and I'm grateful to our moderator, the Right Reverend Daniel Chance, to the Reverend Dr. Nolly Clark, Mr. Jared Granado, Ms. Nicole Poyer, the Reverend Dr. Annabelle Lalaram Kelawan, Reverend Ken Kalu, Joanna Hamid and the entire Hamid family for making today possible, and the Reverend Dr. Randall Sama, and to all of you, many of you who have worked behind the scenes to be here today and to share in this time, not just of remembrance and reflection, but of reinvigoration as we think of these ideas for insights for what we would like our church and society and world to be and to become. Thank you and God bless you. You'll be given instructions now on how to proceed for lunch. Thank you.